Please join me in welcoming our accomplished panelists. So excited to have you here today. You want to join us?
We tossed a coin and decided I should start, so I'm starting. I'm the Ruth Fine person of the two. I think we're going to start talking a little bit about Frankenthaler and then going on to other subjects related to Frankenthaler and her legacy. So, Judy, why don't you talk a little bit about your initial awareness of Frankenthaler and her work in printmaking and whether it had any impact on you?
It's really interesting because Helen Frankenthaler was born in 1928. I was born in 1933, so we're really only 5 years apart. But I didn't start really my career as a professional artist till I was in my early 30s. I got married, it was the 1950s, I got married young, I had 2 children in quick succession, and when they started school, I started back at school, and I started my MFA program at Tyler, but before that, I had to do actually take some courses because I didn't have a BFA. I had a BA degree, but I'd never had any formal training up until that point. So at any rate, that 5-year gap, though, is really interesting, and also the fact that I was, in my early 30s at that particular point, because I was aware of Helen Frankenthaler, because how could one not be aware? This was the 1960s, and she had really emerged as a tremendously important artist. I was really, although I wasn't yet involved in the feminist art movement that came a little bit later in the 1970s, nevertheless, I was aware of the fact that here was a woman who had, been able to make it in the art world. In terms of the way in which she worked and what I was, beginning to do, that 5 years made a real difference, because by then, the reaction against color field painting, against pure abstraction was beginning to take hold. And so I was very drawn to people who were using work that, not figurative or representational, but using elements of that. And I think that had to do probably also with my beginning interest in different ways of looking at art and making art, relating to what I eventually did, which was become very much involved in the feminist art movement. So it was, I was very conscious of the fact that Helen Frankenthaler always was her own person. That's how it came across to me. And so in a way, her being able to have a successful career as an artist was something that really helped me think in those terms, but not so much in terms of the actual look of what she was doing as opposed to what I was interested in.
I should point out that the works that are going on behind us are the works that are in the exhibitions upstairs, and they're not there for us so much to talk about them, but to provoke your curiosity so that you'll go back and see them for real if you haven't already seen the exhibitions.
So I wanted to ask you, because you knew Helen Frankenthaler, and can you talk a little bit about what she was like?
Well, I actually first met Helen Frankenthaler when I was a graduate student at Penn. I was a graduate student from 62 to 64. The only time Penn had a 2-year MFA program. And the star force of that program was a Monday afternoon's roundtable discussion, really, where the students, only from my year, I think, so it was a 2-year program, but so both of the years I was there. And they brought in in a funny way, I guess, the waning stars of the universe. By then, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg were starting to take over the world, but we had Frankenthaler, and we had Ed Reinhardt, and we had David Smith many times, and a whole slew. Frankenthaler and Dory Ashton, as I recall, the critic, were the two women. Barnett Newman was there, and Annalee Newman always traveled with Barnett Newman, so Annalee was there. And it was an amazing moment because, maybe there were 10 of us and one of them, and we just had the most intimate of conversations. So that's when I met her. And one of the things that drew me to her work in particular was what I saw as its landscape source, because the source of my work always was landscape. And so I appreciated that. And I think landscape and place always was really important to her. I got to know her as a grown-up, so to speak, in 1990, when the National Gallery was having all of their curators go ask artists to make donations for the 50th anniversary of the National Gallery of Art. And so I was picked to go visit Frankenthaler. And it was a very interesting experience because I hadn't seen her in many, many years, although we'd been in the same room. And I went to her studio and we talked for a while. And towards the end of that conversation, I told her why I was there. And she was quite annoyed with me because I hadn't sort of said something the minute I walked in the room. Why didn't you let me know what you wanted? And so I told her I didn't let her know what I wanted because I thought it would be useful to get to know each other a little bit. And I think she, in the end, respected that because from then on we actually became quite good friends. And shortly thereafter, the idea, what we were asking for was work on paper. And if you've seen the show out at Penn, you have a sense of how beautiful her unique works on paper are. And she, shortly thereafter, with her studio assistant, showed me every work on paper that she still had. And I chose one that wasn't the obvious choice. I think what the National Gallery really sent me up there to get was a red, yellow, and blue from the 60s with a lot of white paper. And I chose a rather dark covering the whole paper from much later. And I think she also appreciated that in a way, that it wasn't the most obvious and traditional choice. And I think those two events that I sort of answered her back and that I didn't choose the most obvious choice made us fast friends. And so up in close to she died, she had a few bad years at the end of her life, but pretty much up until that point, we stayed connected.
One of the images that I have in my head of her is that she was always beautifully dressed when she went out in public. And she had a fur coat, and she had high heels and pearls. And I liked that because I was not, I was, had a family, and I didn't quite fit the image of an art student. And so it was really very nice for me to see, a woman artist who didn't necessarily go with the crowd in terms of, what she looked like and what she did.
Well, she came from a wealthy New York family and always considered herself lucky and talked about how she was lucky. And she was always very elegant, no matter what she was doing, and cared about that sense of elegance and sense of beauty. I think late in life, she was less engaged by the issues of diversity that were emerging, in the sense that she had very clear ideas of what beauty and quality were, and they were really an outgrowth of history. She was totally involved with art history and historical practice, and collected some very beautiful works of art on her own. She wasn't traditional in that sense, and she certainly wasn't a feminist. It's kind of wonderful now that the Frankenthaler Foundation is expanding to include her in the world of feminist art, because I don't think she would necessarily have wanted that to happen. But I think it's been great for her that it has happened, and that people are looking at her in new contexts, which
well, in a sense,
important.
she was feminist because she did pursue her own way, and she might like the way the world of feminism has evolved currently, where I think there's much less concentration on, first phase, second phase, third phase feminism, and there's this idea of feminism as being able to be yourself. And then also the intersectionality of feminism today, where, to become someone who was such a major figure in the art world, maybe by just doing that, in a sense, she belongs in the canon, if you will, of feminism.
I think that's true, but she would not choose to be in exhibitions of women artists
Right.
per se. She would resent that, but certainly the strength of being a woman was important to her, and she just felt, that's what her strength was
Right.
her strength was her strength.
Well, it's interesting because she's one of so many women who have been influential in printmaking in the 20th and 21st century, including you. And Ruth and I go back. We met in the early 70s. And we met because Ruth went to the National Gallery to be curator of Lessing Rosenwald's collection. And she had been teaching at what was then Beaver College, now Arcadia University. And I took her place as the printmaking professor at Beaver College, having just gotten my MFA at Tyler. So we were actually in Philadelphia at school, at graduate school, at the same time, which I, didn't realize, even though she's, younger than I am. But then, as I was saying before, I didn't do this till, I already was in my early 30s.
Right.
So, so she was a legend, among the students, and the faculty. And I told her the other day when I saw her
As a
that
student on
it
the
took me a
second.
while before I could convince the students, that it was okay that I was there. They weren't ready to, accept me as their printmaking teacher because they adored her so much. But eventually they did, and I had a wonderful experience at Beaver College, which is interesting because you replaced Benton Spruance. You must have replaced Benton Spruance.
Well, he didn't replace Benton Spruance, but I took his job after he died.
Oh, well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Benton Spruance
so-
was unreplaceable.
So the history of, printmaking at Beaver is really an
very
interesting
interesting.
history.
Very interesting.
But then, there are so many women who were influential as artists, like Helen Frankenthaler, but also as curators. Ruth is on the end of the 20th century, but there were people like Una Johnson and Joe Miller who were really shaping the curatorial world at the Brooklyn Museum, which was one of the museums that was really interested in prints. And Una Johnson was the one who established the Brooklyn Biennial print exhibition, which was, to get into that meant that you made it as a printmaker all those years. So
Part
then,
of that, of course, if I may interrupt, is that
Sure.
printmaking was always the low area on the totem pole. So there were many female print curators. I'm blanking, Cleveland had a woman printmaker,
Jane
LA
Cloutinger.
County had in the generation before her.
yeah,
The generation before her, there were a lot of women print curators, and that was really because printmaking was lesser than drawing, was lesser than painting and sculpture. And so part of why women were accepted May I venture that?
Absolutely. It's absolutely true. But then when you think about the women who established shops, so there's first there's Tanya Grossman.
First there's June Wayne.
And June Wayne. So it was Grossman on the East Coast and Wayne on the West Coast, right around 1960, right around the same time period.
And Catherine Brown in 62, also on the West Coast.
Yeah, that's right.
So
yes,
they
she
were
was
the
really
great.
early too. And then there are people like Ann Coffin, who established the International Print Center in New York to establish a place, that would be a gallery where, could focus on continuing, the earlier tradition of shows that would give younger artists a chance to have their work seen.
Kippy Stroud here in Philadelphia with the Fabric Workshop.
Yes.
That was in the 70s.
Absolutely.
But she was certainly a landmark star. How did you get involved with printmaking?
Well, it's kind of, I think I was destined to become a printmaker because when I was an undergraduate, first of all, I'd been drawing and painting since I was, a toddler, I guess. And I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, so I had the wonderful place where I could go study art on Saturday mornings. So for the time I was 6 years old, I was going to the Rhode Island School of Design, on Saturday mornings. Then after class, I could sneak into the museum, which was wonderful, to go into the dim room with the Egyptian stuff and feel the mystery of it. And then one of the things at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum is that they have this incredible collection, decorative arts collection, and they have rooms that are 18th century rooms. And in those days, when I was a kid, people didn't go to museums the way they do now. Now you go to the, the Met Museum in New York, which is, one of the tourist stops in New York, and you can't move. But I could go into the museum when I was a little kid in Providence, and I could sneak under the ropes in these wonderful 18th century rooms and pretend that, I was living in the 18th century because there was no one there to prevent me from doing that. So it was really great. So then my parents, though, didn't want me to go to art school. They wanted me to get proper liberal arts education. So I went to Harvard, where there were only 2 courses that were possible to take in studio. Of course, now Harvard has a big, visual arts program, although they leapfrogged over traditional disciplines and they're more concerned with, photography and video and so on and so forth. But at any rate, so I did an undergraduate thesis, honors thesis on Hogarth and Hogarth's prints. And so I didn't really, at that point I had never done a print. And then when I got to Tyler and I was starting my real, training as an artist, and the dean said, well, you can't just take painting, because I went to be a painter or a sculptor. That's what you did in the 1960s. There was nothing like video or installation or, anything like that. And so he put me in a printmaking class. And I just fell in love with printmaking. There's just no other way to describe it. And I think it had to do a lot with the way I was thinking at the time, which was like Helen Frankenthaler. I come out of a background which was very focused on literature, very focused on all kinds of theoretical approaches to learning, if you will. And so I think all the things that were in my head, printmaking kind of was the right discipline for me. I always think of it that, printmaking is so much a layering kind of process, and also something, not only the layering of plates so that they all fit together properly and with the right colors or in the right places, but also the way in which you work on a plate is a complicated process. You can't just, or most of the time, it isn't just one drawing, one image that you put on a plate. You print it, get a proof, and you look at it, and then you change it, and you develop it further. And I think that sort of fitted the way I was thinking. So I emerged from Tyler. I still took painting courses, but I really emerged as a printmaker. And at first, I used various presses. At that time, there was a press in what is now the Philadelphia Print Club, or it was the Philadelphia Print Club. Now it's the Print Center of Philadelphia. And so up on the top floor, and so I could use that. And then I could go into New York and use a press at Pratt. Then when I got a ticket, driving into New York one day, I thought, this is it, I can't do this, I gotta have my own press. So I bought a press, which I set up in my living room. It was a beautiful piece of furniture in the living room. And then I could do my own printing. So it was really something that, as I say, I think I was destined to become a printmaker. How about you?
Much more accidental, but it's interesting because I started going to art school at it was then the Philadelphia College of Art when I was 11 and went there all the way through. My first introduction to printmaking was in high school because I was in the first class at Northeast High School that accepted women. And so, and they accepted women and you were in 11B. I don't know if they still have A's and B's, but they didn't have a senior year when that school opened. So I was in 11B, and so I was a senior for a year and a half, and they had the best shop program in Philadelphia because it was traditionally a boys' school until it moved to the real far Northeast. And when it moved to the far Northeast, it became co-ed. And I was just totally blown away by the shops and I was the only woman in the shops. And so, of course, everybody loved me because I was there. And so I learned mainly commercial printing, and the instructor wanted to get me a scholarship to continue, but I was going to go to the Philadelphia College of Art under any circumstances. My mother had gone there, graduating in 1935. And so they didn't have any kind of printmaking program. They didn't have a fine arts program. So just as I was at Penn during their only 2-year program, I was at PCA as it was, when they started a fine arts program, which was 1959, and they wouldn't even call it fine arts because it was traditionally a design school. So the fine arts program for the first several years was general arts. And I intended to major in painting. But if you took painting, and this always has interested me since printmaking is supposed to be the techie subject, if you took painting, you had 2 days as a painting major, and you had to take a 3rd day as a painting techniques course. Whereas if you took printmaking as your major, you could have 2 days in printmaking and 1 day in painting. So in order to do both painting and printmaking, I majored in printmaking. And I loved it, but I loved painting just as much. And then when I decided to go to apply to Penn for graduate school, as a printmaking major, I was the only person that applied for printmaking at Penn because painting was the subject. So of course I got the painting fellowship and my tuition was paid. And I was at Penn when Eugene Feldman, I hope he's a name that's familiar to some of you, was a great offset printer in Philadelphia, way better known in Europe and South America than Philadelphia. But Eugene Feldman was setting up an offset shop at Penn. And so, and I set up the etching shop at Penn, actually. There was no printmaking, as I recall, and it was in the furnace building in the caverns where you couldn't breathe. It was absolutely crazy. So that was printmaking, and then I got out, and Benton Spruance actually left PCA. You've got your story, I've got mine. Benton Spruance had a Monday afternoon printmaking major that you couldn't take till you were a senior, because there were no fine arts majors up until I was there. It traditionally was illustration majors that took this Monday afternoon. Everything was Monday afternoon. Monday afternoon lithography course. And Benton Spruance, I think, actually got sick and decided to leave PCA and just teach at Beaver. And So they called me and asked if I would take his Monday afternoon class. So here I was, 24 maybe 25, going into this class where there were all these senior boys who were 2 years younger than me wanting to see Benton Spruance. And I can tell you, the difference between Benton Spruance and me was a lot bigger than the difference between me and you.
Right.
And so finally they got used to the fact that they were stuck with me. And then he died, and that was when I shifted to Beaver. And he had only taught lithography. And so I think I did set up both an etching shop and a silkscreen shop at Beaver, because by the time you got there, we must have had everything. And part of that history, I mean, the history of prints in Philadelphia was very laden with Lessing Rosenwald's presence here and the Rosenwald collection in Jenkintown. And anyone who studied with Benton Spruance was taken to the Rosenwald collection to, in a sense, study print history. And there were never any print history courses. I mean, that was just not an issue in those days. And so when I started teaching Ben's class, he was giving a print history course at the Rosenwald collection for his Beaver students, which he had done for his PCA students, I think, but I'm not sure. And so I would go sit in on his classes in order to learn the history of prints that he taught. And eventually that led to my being at the Rosenwald collection.
You're right, there were no histories of printmaking in those days.
No.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. And then it also, some of the first books that came out about, that had some of the history of printmaking were how to do it books, like the Claire Romano and John Ross books, which always included, you know, some history.
Chapter on history.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And of course there were individual monographs and individual, you know, research on prints, you know, on Rembrandt prints or Picasso prints or Degas prints, but there was nothing that looked at the whole field of printmaking as such for quite a while.
I think of Hyatt Mayer's book, Prints and People, which I think came out when I was a student, A Social History of Prints, which was one of the ones I first learned about. Hyatt Mayer was the curator of prints at the Met. And there was always a social aspect to print, and that was a big part of it. And prints were always of interest to people because they were less expensive than other things, so that, you know, as a young artist, you could start to collect art by collecting prints. I mean, I remember going over, there were always great print shops outside, across the street from the British Museum, and I just remember being there in the 70s and finding all these wonderful things for $10, you know? I mean, you could do so much in terms of forming a collection, and by then I'd stopped teaching by then, but I guess I always thought about having real works of art to talk to students about, and I think I always thought I'd go back to teaching, so I started forming a teaching collection, which was very interesting, and you could do that with almost no money. I mean, you could get fantastic things for $10 in the 70s. It's amazing. And
in New York, too. I can remember, you know, looking at Martin Lewis prints, and I think they were $25. The problem was I didn't have $25. You know, I wish I had, you know, given up eating or something that week so that I had, you know, could have spent my $25 on art, but I didn't do that. So, you know, you have besides your career as an artist, which I know you don't talk about all that much, partly because you've seen it as a conflict of interest with all the work you've done on other artists. It would be wonderful just to hear you talk a little bit about all of the artists that you worked with and all the catalog raisonnés and exhibitions that you've organized. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, my favorite's always the one I'm working on now. I would say before that, my favorite was the Lewis show I did for PAFA a few years ago, mainly because it was such a hugely needed exhibition, and I think critically important. But no, I mean, every experience with every artist is unique and kind of wonderful. I mean, no two are alike. When I was working on, I did do a Frankenthaler print retrospective, and I did it, I was working on it at basically the same time I was working on a Lichtenstein retrospective. And there are no two artists in the world who are more different than Frankenthaler and Lichtenstein, either in their work, in their working habits, in their personalities. And this was in the early 90s. And I learned then how important it was for me, they were both alive, to work on two projects that didn't intersect. A lot of people find it curious that I like to work on more than one thing, and sometimes I do more than I should, but at least two, because I found that working on Frankenthaler and Lichtenstein at the same time highlighted each of them in a way. Just thinking about their contrasts allowed me to understand each of them better. And that was a really revealing experience. And so that was great. But, you know, I'm still working on John's, who I think is still doing some of the most. He's going to be 90 next year. This year, he's going to be 90. And I did a drawing show with another curator, Nan Rosenthal, for his 60th, so 30 years ago. And, you know, it's just remarkable to see his energy. There's going to be a dying show at the University of the Arts in April of some drawings that I kind of introduced them to, and to see Jim Dine's energy. I mean, he's 83, 84, 85. He's got more energy than I have, or than I ever had. And it's you know, a kind of pleasure just to have known all these people, and people who are, you know, they don't have to be famous or that level of fame. There's a show up at Brown now of an artist named Wendy Edwards, who is a great feminist artist. If you don't know her, we had the most amazing discussions of feminist issues, really, called Luscious. And she was a student of mine at the University of the Arts when she was 17 years old in a summer program. Wow. And so that was a great treat too. She's married to a wonderful artist who had a show open in New York this week, so I went up to see the show in the morning before it opened because I couldn't be there at night. So I've always kind of thought artists were the best people in the world. That's and great. That hasn't changed, even the difficult ones. If they're too difficult, they're not worth. If they're too difficult, I never had the energy to work with them, and there were a few. Those stories I won't tell, but they're never not interesting.
And I was seeing them from the other point of view. You were seeing them after the work had been done and working with them, and I was seeing artists in the process of doing their work. And that was one of the reasons that I established the Print Center.
We'll talk about that some more.
Well,
how it happened.
I was just going to say that one of the perks of having a small print center, and eventually I want to ask you about, you know, we should talk a little bit about the small print centers versus the big ones like Gemini, GEL, which I think are quite a different, you know, kettle of fish, so to speak. But one of the perks was to get to choose the artists that I thought were interesting. And at the time that I set up the shop, it was the mid-1980s, and that was really the height of big shops and art world stars doing fabulous, you know, wonderful prints. But it was also a period when there was an opportunity for women artists, artists of color, to have access to shops. The focus was so much on the white male art stars of that particular period. And that's why Helen Frankenthaler is so amazing, because she was able to, make her presence and her work felt, against this white, male supremacy. So she was really astonishing from that point of view. But at any rate, I was very much involved in the feminist art movement at that point. And we knew each other, by the way, in Philadelphia, working on the first feminist project in Philadelphia called Philadelphia Focuses on Women in the Visual Arts. And that took place in 1973-74, which was extraordinarily early. Although we didn't think of it that way. We just thought, this is important and we're going to do this. And we had no idea, until decades later, that this was an important thing that we did. So at any rate, I was coming, I should say I was coming off doing administrative work for Rutgers, which I'd kind of fallen into because I was flattered to be asked to do it. I never thought in terms of, being a university administrator. As a matter of fact, my father, who was a college professor, said to me, don't you ever get involved in administration. He said, it's going to waste your time. But nevertheless, I did. And so I'd been a dean, and eventually I was associate provost of the Rutgers Newark campus. And some of you know, because you've heard me tell this story before maybe, I woke up one night in a cold sweat and thought, what am I doing here? When I'm on my deathbed, do I want to say I've been a university administrator, or do I want to make more art? And it was absolutely clear to me that I wanted to make more art. So I walked into the office of the person I reported to, and I said, I have to resign. And he was very sweet, and he said, how about just working 2 days a week, and you can have 3 days, in your studio. And I said, I know me, that's not going to work. I would just, fill the time with what I needed to do, in my job. So I went back to teaching, and I went back with the idea of establishing a print shop, and establishing a print shop that would, the mission of which would be to provide the opportunity for women artists, for artists of color, for artists from countries other than Western Europe, to have access to first-rate facilities and to be able to work with master printers, and then very shortly after that also with paper makers. And so it was very exciting for me to be able to invite some of the people that, whose work I admired very much, to come and to be involved in printmaking. And my first master printer was the late John Hutchison, who had worked with Ken Tyler, and he and Ken had a falling out. And
The late?
what?
He's not dead, is he?
He's dead. Yes, he died. Yeah, in Florida. I'm sorry to be the bearer of sad news. Yeah, he died about 4 or 5 years ago, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, and then the first prints we did were actually with a white male, but one whom I admired tremendously, Leon Golub, who was my colleague at Rutgers. And although Rutgers was very excited about the fact that I set up the shop, they didn't give me any operating money. So the first prints projects that we did were with people where we didn't have to bring them in, we didn't have to provide accommodations for them, we didn't have to, give them an honorarium. So Leon was one of the first people that we did prints with, which was really fun for me because Leon had actually been one of my professors when I was at Tyler. And then I just couldn't believe that eventually, when I went to Rutgers, that we were going to be colleagues, so it was very exciting for me. But it was really wonderful to get to know the artists who came into the shop. And also my concept had been to have the artists working side by side with the students, so that the students would have the opportunity to get to know, artists who were well-known, who were not their normal faculty, advisors, professors, and out of that, a lot of students, made their way after graduation, into the art world as a result of finding out how you manage, how do you, you know, how you create a career, how you contact galleries, and so on and so forth. So it was very productive for the students as well. So that's sort of how I got into it. And then, of course, as I hope all of you know, the Brodsky Center is no longer at Rutgers, and it is here at PAFA, which I am thrilled about. And Paola Morciani, who's sitting over there, put your hand up, good, is the director. I no longer, you know, have anything to do with it other than help whenever Paola needs me to do something, which is usually to help raise money or, you know, or something along those lines. But at any rate, it was really an exciting period for me. We worked with over 300 artists over the years that I was running the center, and so I really got to know a tremendous number of artists who've now emerged, you know, as important people with their own influence in the art world. So that's been exciting to see that happen. So that's sort of how I got involved and why I liked it. Mm-hmm. But I also had in mind, June Wayne was a very good friend of mine, and she had set up Tamarind at the same time that Tanya Grossman had set up ULAE, and June had set up the Tamarind workshop to train master printers, which was something that was really a new thing in the United States. And she did that because she got tired of going to France to have her editions pulled, and she wanted to, you know, see if she could start a situation in the States where there were master printers who could work with artists. So they had a little bit different kind of organizational thought about, you know, how to bring prints into a position in the United States where more artists would get involved in printmaking. So I thought, what's needed now? We didn't need master printers anymore because there were plenty of them. And I felt that what we needed was to inject a little inclusivity, social justice into the art world and begin to bring in the artists into printmaking who were bringing new ideas, new voices into the American cultural mainstream.
I think that's a good time to start.
I'm sorry?
Should we ask for questions?
Yeah, okay.
I think.
Yeah. Question.
So we could go on and talk forever, of course, but probably shouldn't, and wonder if you have any questions you'd like to ask. We don't have any microphones, so if you could speak loudly, we can then repeat your questions to be sure everybody has heard them.
What would you like us to talk about?
Well, there's a
besides what we have?
question.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Can you address Helen Frankenthaler's, if she combined painting and printmaking, or if she had a very different mindset when she was painting versus when she was printmaking, sort of how she made the decisions?
So the question is whether Helen Frankenthaler had different mindsets when she was painting and making prints. And I would say absolutely not. And if you look in the show, there is a 1971 print on the, as you come in the front door on your left, the second print in. And then there's a painting behind a wall at the back of the show, also 1971. And it's as good a demonstration as you could get of the mindset being absolutely the same. The difference, I would say, is that printmaking was a collaborative activity. So she had other people around her and helping her. But, and she did not, I do not believe at all, have painting assistants. She had assistants who would stretch canvases, possibly mix paint, but I doubt that. So nobody helped with the paintings. People did help with the prints. But I would say the decisions about the prints were absolutely hers. And whatever she was working on in painting, if you look at, she did not work, if you see, very often you see an exhibition of an artist's work from the last 2 years, let's say. Frankenthaler's work from the last 2 years would not have a consistency of image about it. There would be a range of images, but they would all talk to each other in a way. And so the same would be true of the prints, that the prints from a period of time would have a range of images. But there would be a relationship between the prints and the paintings. And, you know, she would be in the studio, but she might have set an appointment to go out to a print shop, so she would stop being in the studio and go out to the print shop. But she usually went back and forth. She did not work on the West Coast, except 1 or 2 times, and Europe, but mainly going in and out to the print shops was a convenience for her. So totally mindset, but look at those 2 works and you'll see it unmistakably.
Do you think Helen ever evolved to embrace women artists, or do you think, because I know her in the late 80s and the 90s, and I think the way you described her mindset was absolutely accurate then. Do you feel she ever evolved to accept what was going on in the world, to accept the move toward multiculturalism, toward looking at all artists equally, whether they were women, men, black, white, etc.? What was she like in her later years in terms of those issues?
I don't think it was a matter of not accepting at all. The question was, did Frankenthaler evolve to be engaged by issues of multiculturalism, and did she accept women artists? I think she accepted, I think she saw the art, and I don't think she asked who did it. I don't think she cared who did it. I don't think she would have a social framework as her primary way to think about art. I think
That was her mindset.
I think, you know, it's not a subject we discussed in a sense, but that's my feeling, that she saw the art, she responded to the art, she would then know who did the art. She did not say who did that and try and make sense out of what they were doing based on who they were.
And I think that comes through in the interview that she did for the Archives in American Art, which I read, you know, in terms of coming here today. She's very explicit about, you know, her concern is for the art ideas. It didn't involve the people necessarily. I mean, of course, she had incredible relationships with different people, but in terms of the art itself, it was you know, the art ideas, the aesthetics of the art that comes through in that oral interview.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how do you think her art changed over time?
Question was, how did her art change over time? Well, you know, I think if you look at if you look at the first work on the left and the last work on the right, that would be the answer. That there's a kind of clarity. I mean, she was always interested in abstraction. I think the complexity is what changed over time. I think what she embraced changed over time. And I think that was true with the paintings as well as the prints and the works on paper, that she kept looking and learning and feeling, and I think that's all in there. You know, we're so much a culture of youth now that I think we don't necessarily pay attention. This is an old girl speaking, obviously, but we don't necessarily think about the layers of knowledge that get embedded in the work of artists as they age. And I think that's very clearly in her work. I think it's clearly in the work of anybody I know who's in their 80s. She didn't live to be in her 80s, but they may still be using motifs they were using in their 30s and their 20s, but they're not using them the same way if they're good, or if they're good by my definition. I guess we all have what we think of as good, just as she did. So I think that's how it changed. I think it got smarter. I think it got more sensitive. I think it got more layered. What do you think?
I agree. I also think there's such a unity between her paintings and the works on paper. So she's approaching them in the same way. And so they're probably both feeding into each other. For instance, all of the use of aquatint, sugar lift, whatever, that creates the prints with these, very soft edges, which is really an extraordinary thing. And she's the one that really introduces that kind of printmaking, in my opinion, or one of the earliest to do that, because before that you really have mostly hard edge, kinds of shapes, colors, lines, but that softness to the edges is something that I think is very much introduced by her. And that's the same kind of thing that you see in the paintings developing as well from the earlier paintings. So she probably was thinking, back and forth between the two. And I think that happens to a number of artists that work with both prints. The artists who love printmaking, like Kiki Smith, for instance, who loves printmaking. I'll go anywhere, anytime to make a print or a book. And I think that feeds back into, all the work that she does in sculpture, drawing, very much so in the drawings, which I think look more like prints than the prints look like drawings. So, and that's how I feel about Helen Frankenthaler's work, that it just goes back and forth. And she tries something out in prints, and then it shows up in the paintings, and vice versa.
I think one of the most important thing about prints, if there are any PhDs in the room, PhD students in the room, I don't think anybody's really investigated the importance of prints in the post-war period in this country. And I don't think, I think a huge case could be made that the development of painting is based on the development of prints in any artist who use printmaking in a creative way. Because if you sit in a print studio, there's always waiting time. If you sit in a print studio, you're always seeing the proofs like the ones upstairs. And you think in different ways. You're slowed down. You're with other people. And I think especially for Helen's generation, I think for my generation, and the two people I think of this way, for example, are Pat Steer and Mel Bachner, who were essentially my age. And I think in both instances, their printmaking functions as their drawings and impacts whatever else they do. By my time, it was just there. But for people like Frankenthaler and Dine and Johns and Rauschenberg and Warhol, it wasn't there. Printmaking was new. And they were looking at it in new ways and thinking about it in new ways. And the only person that I think it's been looked at for it all is Johns. Jennifer Roberts did a book about Johns' prints. I can't think of the name right now, published, I think, by Yale. But I think for none of these other artists. And when I was a kid, I used to think, oh, well, when I get old, that's the book I'm going to write. Well, I'm not going to write it, but I would love for somebody to write it. I mean, I think absolutely, it's very important. Anyway, question?
Yeah, I wanted to segue on some of this because I always have wondered if she made her paper and was looking at the absorbency of it, and if so the soft edges come out of wanting a certain kind of paper, and I know she used a variety. And is that related to using unprimed canvases, which also produce a soft edge? So this idea of softness comes out of some of the substrate.
Yeah, but the canvas came first.
Yeah.
The canvas for her was 10 years before the before the prints, or 8 years before, I mean, a long time before the prints.
The softness of her edges comes out of the absorbency
Yeah.
of the support.
Right, but it may have gone from the canvases
that
first
came
into
from
the
the
paper,
canvas.
to an interest in paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She didn't, I mean, she did work with paper making, but that was very much at the end of her career. Right around the time of my show, around the early 90s, was when she got involved with Tyler, with actually making works from paper pulp, and there weren't very many of them. I can only think of two.
Because the hand paper making movement really
Yeah.
began to gather steam just around that time. Before that, there wouldn't have been very many opportunities to make paper before that in a shop.
No, Tyler had been making it for a long time before that. Tyler started making paper when he moved to the East Coast, and that was the 70s. So Tyler was
Yeah, that's
starting
true.
paper making in the 70s, but she didn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I don't remember what year the Tullis ones are. So the paper making thing, I mean, she was very involved with hand paper making issues, but she wasn't making paper.
Can you talk about which print shops she worked in? Where did she go to do her print making?
The two major shops were ULAE and then Ken Tyler. But she worked in 2RC, she worked with Garner Tullis, she worked with Mixographia. I'm forgetting some. Yeah, she worked with Crown Point twice. She did their Japan project, and she did, I think, Nepenthe, which was a little bit before that, was published by SF Mom, I think, and John Berggruen was involved. Anyone else want to toss in some workshops? She worked with several, but the primary ones were ULAE and Ken Tyler. And Pace, at the end of her life, she worked, the woodcuts at the end of her life several of them were with Pace Prints. And their workshop in New York.
And had she ever done prints when she was there a print shop at Bennington?
Not that I know of.
Yeah. So she really came to prints through working at
ULAE.
master print shops.
Yeah, as far as I know, I don't know of anything earlier.
Yeah.
I think her, First Stone is the first stone in the catalog, and that's ULAE, 1960 or 61. Okay, well, if anybody wants to come ask questions up here, you're welcome to. And otherwise, I think we should say thank you very much for coming and being such a good audience.